From the time humans first settled this country, they've constantly tried to modify the environment to suit themselves. That process is most obvious in our cities, but here in the country there's a less obvious but perhaps even more serious problem. These paddocks are affected by salt, and salting is far more common and widespread than most people think. In fact, vast areas of formerly productive crop and grazing land have been reduced to wasteland by salt. Production losses caused by salinity in both irrigated and dry land areas amount to millions of dollars per year, and thousands of hectares of land are affected. Salting is responsible for the contamination of water resources. It increases the susceptibility of land to erode by stunting or killing protective plant cover and damaging soil structure. Salting can also affect household appliances such as water heaters and lead to the loss of wildlife habitats and recreational areas. But salt itself is not the real culprit, even though it ultimately does the damage. Salt has been around in the soil and in the rocks of the Earth's crust for centuries. It's only when excess water can transport the salt up into the root zone of the plants that the damage is evident. And with groundwater levels rising, we're literally being flooded from below. So what causes this situation? What are the processes that can make productive land almost worthless and affect such a large area that it becomes a significant threat to Australia's agricultural production? One source of salting is from salt, mostly sodium chloride, which is carried into the atmosphere from the sea surface and is then blown inland and deposited in falls of rain. This causes the build-up of a large quantity of salt over the landscape. Some of this salt is then leached downwards through the soil where it builds up in the groundwater. Some salt is picked up and carried by streams into rivers and back into the ocean. But a major source of salt in river areas is that left behind when lands flood and the waters evaporate, depositing salt with the alluvium. Salt is also released when rocks are broken down by weathering. Salt was left behind in sediments deposited beneath the sea, which covered most of the inland regions in prehistoric time. Salt can also be left behind when lakes retreat or the water evaporates away. The groundwater containing dissolved salt builds up in the air spaces between the particles of soil and sand or in cracks between rocks. Sand and gravel layers which carry water underground are called aquifers, and they can be filled up by the groundwater seeping downwards. The uppermost level of the soil and rock saturated with groundwater is called the water table. The level of the water table can vary from ground to up to hundreds of metres below the surface. Excess water from rain or flooding seeping into the ground will bring the water table closer to the surface, whereas during a dry spell or drought, the water table usually drops because of flow away from the area, plant usage or seepage to drains. Before European settlement in Australia, most of the countryside was covered by deep-rooted species, trees, shrubs or grasses and herbs. What was not realised was that the deep subsoils of the land held large amounts of salt in equilibrium. The only time that water reached these deep layers was during excess wet periods. However, the first settlers cleared land for the crops and stock needed to feed the growing population. Large forest areas were cut down to provide timber for mines and to build the houses associated with them. Clearing also provided more pasture land for grazing sheep to build up the wool trade to help balance trading figures. Then, towards the end of last century, many trees ended up as sleepers for railway tracks or as fuel for the boilers on the trains themselves. Large tracts of forest were cut down to provide firewood for city dwellers. Overall, more than 75% of the forests in Australia were converted to grassland, and it was the clearing of the deep-rooted perennial forests and replacing them with shallow-rooted plant species incapable of using the region's rainfall that has been the primary cause of soil salting on non-irrigated land. You see, trees take up water through the roots, pump it through the trunk and branches, and it eventually passes out through tiny pores in the leaves in a process called transpiration. The blue gum is one of the greatest water users. Each tree can transpire up to 250 litres in one day. Trees also catch rain in the foliage and do not allow much water to even reach the ground. This water is then evaporated away into the atmosphere. Now, when deep-rooted trees are replaced by shallow-rooted or annual pasture, water soaks deep into the subsoil, dissolving stored salts as it goes. This saline water then increases the level of the groundwater, bringing the water table closer to the roots of the plants. When a water table rises to within 2 metres of the surface, water can be drawn up to the surface and evaporated by wind and warmth. The water climbs up the tiny pores of the soil by capillary action, the same process that you see in a straw. Any dissolved salts in this capillary water will not be evaporated with the water and can accumulate in the topsoil, threatening the health of the soil. Salting can also occur as the result of irrigation, which raises the water table when excess water from inefficient flood irrigation or channel seepage infiltrates below the root zone out of the reach of plants, building up the water table. Rain on a land surface already wetted by irrigation causes a greater rise of the water table, and in winter, when evaporation and plant water use is low, this can be even more dramatic. The first signs of salting are generally an increase in the growth of salt-tolerant species such as spiny rush. Plants often change colour and lose vigour, particularly at the top. Increasing soil salting has a progressive effect on crop growth with reduced yields, damage to plants and restrictions on crop types. Pasture yields are also reduced with a loss in clover and often an excess of barley grass or salt-tolerant species. In severe cases, no plants will grow at all. Excess salt can be absorbed by leaves, irrigated by overhead sprinklers, and once salt levels are built up, growth and fruit production are inhibited, especially in citrus, peach and pear trees. Excess sodium in a soil can damage the actual soil structure, retarding plant growth, which in turn forms less organic matter, causing further breakdown of the soil structure. Such a soil becomes a sticky, erosion-prone slurry when wet and cakes hard on drying, becoming impervious to moisture. This makes seed germination difficult. Stock movement or cultivation of such caked soils can then easily break them up into a loose powder. On salt land where no plants grow, the bare topsoil is exposed to the erosive forces of wind and rain, leading to gully erosion which may expose the water table, resulting in highly saline trickle flows, which pollute water supplies for stock, aquatic life and domestic water supplies further downstream. So not only is there a loss of income experienced by landholders whose properties are damaged by salt, but those who receive the drainage from their properties can suffer also. That loss flows onto the cities, where people who make chemicals, tractors, groceries and so on rely on country sales for their jobs. If they are not earning, the people who rely on them for support, down to the last corner shop, can suffer. Loss of farm production affects the local community as well. With reduced incomes, farmers are less able to invest in farm improvement schemes or new equipment. They are less able to buy goods and services, so the prosperity of a town is at risk and opportunities for employment are reduced. Other aspects of community life can be affected too. Sporting areas such as racetracks and golf courses can be damaged. Road foundations can be broken down since salt affects the bitumen, drying it out so that it soon breaks up. The quality of drinking water can be impaired, and salt in freshwater breeding habitats adversely affects wildlife, particularly birds. So, salinity is a matter of concern for all of us, because it affects the livelihood of many people, it affects the land which produces much of our food, it may increase the cost of food, it pollutes waterways and affects wildlife and recreational activities, it places a burden on taxpayers and the government, and if nothing is done, it'll get worse. What can be done about all this? Well, already there are hundreds of projects working in Victoria in areas where the catchments are small. One of the more successful ones is here at Burke's Flat. You can see the recharge area for the groundwater, where most of the rainfall moves downward into the underlying geological formations. You can also see the discharge zone, where the groundwater moves upward and escapes via springs, evaporation or surface drainage, and it's here where the salinity has its most damaging effect. However, by planting trees and deep-rooted plants such as lucerne in the recharge areas, most of the ingoing water is mopped up so that the water table can be kept down at a safe level. Roger Standen of the Department of Conservation, Forest and Lands has been involved with the project here for quite some time. Well, Roger, just how effective has the project been in terms of regenerating the land?
Well, as far as the salt-affected area at the bottom of the valley, that hasn't disappeared as yet, but up in the recharge area we're seeing drops in groundwater levels of 3 or 4 metres already after just a few years.
It's really very encouraging.
It certainly is, and the other thing about it is that in the meantime the farmers here are getting benefits from the pastures that we've incorporated.
What's been the benefit of actually working with a small catchment?
There's a number of things. The small number of landholders make the whole cooperative part of the project a lot easier to organise, and the smaller volume of water in the catchment means that we can see a response in a shorter time.
So it gives you like a working model.
That's right, yes, and that's what we've taken from here, the indications from here that we're on the right track with plants using the water before it gets into the groundwater. We're taking that concept into the larger catchments with the encouragement that it's working here on the small one, and hopefully it will work again on the larger one.
How specifically have the individual farmers benefited from the project?
The main one, I guess, is the extra feed in the spring, early summertime, so they can grow their weaner sheep out, and increasing the carrying capacity of the land, so they grow more sheep, run more sheep on the land, and cut more wool.
It all sounds pretty good, but have there been any problems with it?
Oh, there's a few hiccups. The cost involved in the tree planting and fencing out those areas is a large cost for virtually no short-term return, and that's one of the difficulties, and a few associated management things with the lucerne, which is different to the normal practice that they carry on around here.
You obviously haven't had a problem with cooperation from the landowners in this case.
It's been excellent. In fact, they've been one of the main instigators of getting the whole thing going. They've been good.
Well, what does the future hold then?
I think the future's very encouraging. We're not only getting benefits in hopefully 15 to 20 years down the track, those areas you were walking through will be disappeared and we'll have productive pasture on those. But in the time between now and then, the landholders are getting a lot of benefit. The whole environment is improving because of the tree planting, the improvement in the soil.
Another region where the catchment is relatively confined is here in the Warrenbane and Boho valleys in northeastern Victoria. At these locations we can see some of the most graphic examples of salt-affected land. Revegetation of the recharge area is again the main strategy, but this time, due to the steepness of the area, this can only be done by aerial seeding. There is a very active group of landholders in this area who meet regularly to discuss problems and develop solutions. They have appointed a coordinator for all these activities, and there is also an education officer working in the area. Regular camps, farm walks and community tree planting exercises are conducted to educate people about the problem. This model of the area is used to explain how the salting occurs and what is being done to attack the problem.
The effect is, as we can see on this model, bare areas of land. The grasses and the trees tend to die, and because the salt in the particles of the soil, that salt stops the particles of soil from sticking together. So generally speaking, wherever we get salinity on the soil, we also get erosion.
Although this is a relatively small community within a well-defined local catchment, community involvement and cooperation is very important. This group maintains a high profile, and their efforts and achievements are an inspiration to farmers in other nearby regions. Pam Robinson is the chairperson of the landholders group.
Well, we've achieved a lot of things, I think. We've achieved everything from a sense of real community working together. There's a sense of community development. There's a sense of neighbourliness. But within works on the ground, we've achieved a lot. I think something like 65,000 trees have been planted now on recharge areas. That's native trees. There's also been some 30,000 fodder trees planted, and there's been a lot of gully and sheet erosion addressed. I suppose one starts off wanting absolutely everybody in it, but that's, you don't always get absolutely everybody in it. But even if some people are not necessarily actively doing something within the group sense, a lot of people are watching other people. So as long as people are really getting on with works, that's the aim of the whole thing.
And what do you think the future then holds for this region?
Well, I feel very positive about it. There's a lot of work to be done. Dryland salinity, we're only learning more about it every day, but I think the approach that we've got, we're certainly going to be able to reverse some of the situations that would have otherwise just completely wiped out a lot of productive land.
The two regions that we've looked at so far have been examples of dry land salting involving only a localised water table, catchments that can be managed fairly easily. On a much larger scale are the regional catchments of the Broken and Goulburn rivers. In this region, much of the productivity and prosperity of the region has resulted from rich farming land, irrigation and the processing plants located within the region. But the rainfall on top of constant irrigation has meant a gradual build-up in the water tables underlying the region. These maps show how the level of groundwater has risen in just 4 years between 1982 and 1986. The strategies for this region fall into two main categories. Now, the first is to actually reduce the amount of water that gets into that water table. Now, that can be achieved in a number of ways, but the most spectacular method is laser levelling. This is where laser-controlled equipment is used to remove hollows and bumps and put a slope on the land so that water drains much more quickly across the land after irrigation or heavy rain. This stops excess water from seeping down into the earth past the root zone of the plants. Another method is to reconstruct irrigation channels so that they can supply adequate water flows to the paddocks, but still be drained off as fast as possible. During the irrigation season, this runoff water is reused on normal pasture land. For horticultural crops, trickle and mini sprinkler systems are used. These not only reduce the amount of water reaching the water tables, but actually increase productivity. Improved drainage systems across the whole region prevent water covering the land for long periods. This is especially important during wet winters, which result in dramatic water table rises, which are very hard to reverse, even in drought periods. The second major strategy for this area is an extension of the groundwater pumping scheme, which commenced nearly 20 years ago. Now, that was in response to record wet years and was designed primarily to protect prime horticultural areas. It's a combination of both private and public pumping enterprises, but the disposal of this slightly saline groundwater is carefully controlled. Where the quality of the groundwater is good, and generally the further east you go the better, the pumping has provided not only remarkable groundwater control, dropping the level below 2 metres, but it's also provided additional water for district farmers. There is a drilling service provided by the Rural Water Commission, which can help farmers find aquifers capable of providing supplementary supplies of groundwater for irrigation. John Dainton is the chairman of the Pilot Catchment Management Plan for the Goulburn Broken region.
At the present time, there's a third of the region, which represents the irrigation area of 500,000 hectares. 35% of that region has water tables within 2 metres of the surface, which is the critical level. And water table maps indicate that that's continuing to rise. We can arrest water table rises in strategic areas with phase A pumps, and that reduces the water table in the horticulture area to protect it. But on a regional basis, water tables are still rising.
Well, can you tell me how effective has the pilot management scheme been so far?
The pilot management scheme, in my opinion, has been the best thing that's happened to the region. It has created the public awareness that is so desperately needed, not only within the landholders but within the general community as such. And now I believe that there is a general understanding of salinity within the Goulburn-Broken catchments.
Well, I guess we should finally ask, what does the future look like for the region?
I think the future's very good. What the management plan is going to demand of landholders is far better land management. So they'll be looking a lot more closely at every action they do, and when you do that, productivity gains obviously will follow. So I don't see a bleak future. In fact, I see exactly the opposite. But it's going to mean big changes to landholders' attitudes and the way they farm.
Here in the Kerrang area, the problem is slightly different because the groundwater contains very high, even toxic levels of salt, often as salty as the sea, and affects many thousands of hectares. So, saline agricultural methods have to be adopted. The Kerrang Agricultural Research Farm was founded in 1956. It's involved in developments which not only assist salt reclamation, but hopefully will avoid the problem in the future, whilst raising the productivity of the area. These include land layout and saltwater usage, crop development including sunflowers, sorghum, saltbush and lucerne growing, and agroforestry. Tree plantings have shown that there are a number of different native trees that can successfully grow in saline areas to produce a tree belt for the protection of animals and crops whilst utilising the groundwater. Some farm properties that have been planted with tree belts around each side of pasture paddocks have shown an increase in production despite a loss of grazing area where the trees are planted. Gun Jones has lived and worked in the area for many years.
Well, the prospects depend on how well these techniques are taken up by the community. Although 40% of the land has been reconstructed using laser control, a lot of it hasn't been done in a planned situation. We're encouraging people to have whole farm plans. We're encouraging people to not only lay out paddocks, but to put drains at the bottom, which a lot of lasered paddocks haven't, and to reconstruct their channels at the top of the paddock, because all this butte land layout isn't much good unless you can apply water fast and adequately, and you can get it off fast and adequately.
In the last year, you've joined the Kerrang Lakes Working Group, which covers the west of Loddon and the Avoca River catchment. What's this committee set up for?
Well, the committee is set up as part of the government plan to look at the salt problem. That area has been one that the community feel has been forgotten a bit, and the sub-regional committee was set up to give the area a fair go. It's also set up to restore the heritage of the area. So there's a whole series of reasons, environmental, human and heritage reasons for setting it up.
The main drainage network for the Kerrang region is Bar Creek. It carries water from irrigation runoff from channel leaks and seepage, as well as rainfall runoff out of the area. Up until 1968, it also carried 180,000 tonnes of salt each year downstream to the Murray River. But since that time, this pumping station now takes some of the water and takes it away to Lake Tutchiwop, where it evaporates. This scheme ensures that the salinity further down the Murray River never exceeds a predetermined fixed value. However, this is only a minor strategy in the management of the whole major river system, the Murray-Darling Basin. As far back as 1829, Charles Sturt noted in his diary during one of his exploratory journeys that the water in the lower Darling River was not fit to drink because it was too salty. The Murray-Darling system has always carried high background levels of dissolved salt, and in such a climate with high evaporation rates, there have always been a number of naturally occurring salt lakes. All the rivers that feed into the Murray at different places over its 2,500 kilometre winding journey contribute salt which is then carried downstream towards the mouth of the river. The management of this region, which covers an area of about a quarter of the whole of Australia and includes 4 states, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia, is a major organisational problem. But since the formation of the River Murray Commission in 1914 and accelerated by a severe drought in 1967-68, this problem has been addressed. As recently as 1982, a new agreement formally acknowledged that the protection or improvement of the quality of water in the river was an explicit objective for the future. The major proposals being considered can be listed under 3 main headings. Interception of saline groundwater, and there are 8 major schemes in operation. Dilution by releasing fresh water from reservoirs into the river from time to time, and catchment management, the Bark Creek catchment and the Goulburn Broken catchment.
These measures at best could reduce the salt level by 16%, but it will need to be accepted that salinity will always increase downstream by natural causes alone. So for the irrigation areas of South Australia, they'll always have a problem, as will the people of Adelaide in obtaining good drinking water from this river.
There is another important factor to be considered: conservation of existing wetlands and other natural wildlife habitats. A survey of off-farm salt-affected areas will begin shortly, which will lead to rehabilitation of selected salt-affected environments. Also, farm advisory services will encourage landholders to retain and enhance wetlands, trees and other wildlife habitats on their properties. It is essential that clearing of native vegetation from natural drainage lines be minimised, and clearing of waterways with significant habitat value should be avoided too. Licensing procedures will be introduced to supervise these activities.
Because of the widespread economic and social effects of salinity, community awareness, understanding and participation are all essential to the overall success of a salinity control program. Even though farmers are the most directly and seriously affected, really the effects flow onto the entire community through water pollution, general loss of income and loss of environmental quality. So the whole community must be involved in combating the problem.
As part of this development, a salinity journalist has been appointed. Apart from being involved in the publishing of the bi-monthly Salt Force News, this person is also responsible for supplying news releases to the media and organising displays. Community education staff have been appointed to carry out education and information activities. They visit each of the salinity regions every 2 months and assist in the development of education programs, incorporating management strategies and resource usage. There is also a very well-developed salinity curriculum in the schools. Salt watch programs where adults and children collect and analyse water samples from creeks, rivers and bores are conducted. Regular tree planting and farm walk excursions are conducted, and a complete curriculum document and slide set called Why Worry About Salt has been developed by the Geography Teachers Association of Victoria.
We can manage our water supplies and our environment to both combat the salt problem and also leave the land productive too. We have to develop better land use methods, new techniques for total farm management. We also need to do more research into groundwater movement and to develop salt-tolerant vegetation species. We also have to develop new subdivisions for bush blocks in recharge areas with realistic compensation for landowners. The problem is being tackled and it can be solved, but it requires the cooperation of the entire community. That's you and me. It shouldn't just be left to farmers.
We came from the farms of Europe and we cleared the trees from the land, but the balance of bushland, rocks and rain we did not understand. How could we have ever imagined when we cut the forests down that this would cause the water to rise from deep below the ground? You see, much of our land is forest land, and it lets the water in, and without the trees to stand between, too much rain soaks in, and an underground flood is rising, bringing salt up by degrees, and our land will turn into salty waste if we don't replace the trees. But we can hold the salt, help heal the land. We can plant trees with our own two hands. We can bring back the balance a little each year till the soil is sweet again and all the rivers run clear. Well, you can't drink salt